We are in an era of turbocharged wartime propaganda at the moment. Everyone can see, hear, feel this because we have eyes, ears, hearts. We know that we are being distracted from facts, or rather the absence of facts, and being directed towards sensationalist narratives and opinions that trigger strong emotions. This is how the powerful keep the disempowered on a tight leash without any restraints whatsoever, by controlling your emotions. In the global south, it's difficult to know whether someone is trying to emotionally manipulate you to drive towards certain decisions or behaviors, because the reality is that we grew up in an environment in which everyone is trying to push their agenda onto us to make us commit to something, to coerce us through emotionally manipulating us. Everyone from our parents, our relatives, our teachers, our social media feed, our media sources, everything is maxed out on the emotional dial. Everyone is shouting, shouting, shouting all the time. Even on podcasts, which are literally edited for audio quality, everyone is shouting. We accept this as so-called culture across the global south. No, this is not culture. This is a colonial system of propaganda that is centuries old. Centuries, generations. This is how you receive information now in colonized contexts across the global south. What is this doing to us? How can we know when we are being emotionally manipulated and, in many cases, spoken to like children by hegemonic forces?
What you said about propaganda is very spot on. And I think right now, especially the last few months, there are a lot of dynamics happening that overlap and converge, and that propaganda takes advantage of. So polarization, the planetary systems collapse accelerating, turbo speed, World War III bucking up, society cannibalizing itself. And I think there's also this sort of post-truth landscape where everyone claims their own truth, which is being used to justify entitlement and feed cultures of narcissism and dissociation that is made even worse with AI and deep fakes. So it's almost kind of like propaganda takes advantage of all this kind of anxiety and confusion and creates this sense of more urgency, so you feel like you need to take a decision quickly, which leads you more easily into falling to patterns of groupthink or confirmation bias. Or so I think this dynamic is happening pretty much everywhere, especially here in the global south. I see that a lot, like this kind of anxiety that never ceases, and that kind of interfere on how people make decisions because they are taking decisions from this space of overwhelm. As you said, this is a centuries old thing and will continue to exist, the propaganda and the emotional manipulation. And even though we can control what happens externally, we can control how we respond, how we regulate ourselves, how we set boundaries. And I think there is an importance here of three practices of critical thinking, critical feeling, critical practice. So polarization in this kind of environment of anxiety and urgency erodes nuance. So it becomes difficult to ask deeper questions about what's happening if the focus shifts from to defending identities instead of examining what's happening and examining systems. We need to actually seek multiple sources, multiple worldviews to move beyond consuming just narratives that reinforce what we already believe. So this is the way we can form our critical thinking and kind of dodge this manipulation and groupthink that is happening. Another important aspect in that, I think, is to map the emotional patterns we tend to fall into to cope with overwhelming realities. So this is how you build critical feeling, I think, recognizing these patterns in yourself, because emotional manipulation works exactly by using your responses. So when you know your triggers, your tendencies, you can act from, I think, this combination of instinct and rationality in a way that is not pure reaction and defensiveness. And then critical practice, that is the importance of embed ourselves in actual contexts. And this will contribute to the critical thinking and critical feeling, because it helps you ground your analysis in lived reality and not just theory or abstraction or what people are talking about online. So experiencing things for yourself to help you form thoughts about your opinion on things, and regulate your emotions better.
I think that's exactly the genius of propaganda as a tool of collective emotional manipulation, because in the global south, we exist in collectivist societies, and so the identity is collective, sense making is collective, and then you have this mass propaganda, mass communication channels that are dishing out this emotional manipulation, which kind of causes literally everybody around you, which is how you make sense of things, to
Mm-hmm.
repeat these narratives and to go into these spirals of emotional manipulation. So it is very difficult to break out of that. And so it's like when you're speaking in this highly, highly conditioned context about critical thinking and critical feeling, those things, like there's nowhere to ground that. There is nowhere to understand, like, but what is the way that I even assess a fact? How do I know that something that I'm being triggered by emotionally is actually based on a fact, or is it just based on some kind of like media narrative that is totally orchestrated so that I feel like this along with the rest of my entire community about that topic or that person or that political party or whatever it is? Because it's about manipulating opinion. Opinion is what leads to behavior. So when you are able to see those things about actually practicing critical feeling, actually practicing critical thinking, you become the only one in your society who's actually doing that. And so the rest of society sees that you're isolating yourself. The rest of society sees that why do you think you're better than us? Why do you look at us when we go absolutely batshit crazy over something happening? And then you're kind of saying, like, well, this seems like we're being manipulated, but you're not on our side. So there's a mechanism here that serves to essentially bring you back into the fold as soon as you try to step out of it. Because again, we exist in collectivist societies. To become isolated, especially to self-isolate, is essentially a recipe for disaster, and potentially it could hurt your actual health and well-being. For example, if you run into some medical problems or if you run into economic problems, etc., because there is no safety net otherwise. So you have to maintain relationships with the collective, but at the same time, most people in the collective don't come to the same conclusions at the same time around, hey, we need to cultivate critical thinking and critical feeling here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, for sure. There is this feeling of isolation that is very, as you said, it functions in a way that is, if you try to disassemble yourself from this behavior, this predicted behavior, and everyone around you is following that, it's kind of like, I don't know if it's also a collective trauma mechanism of trying to protect how things are, even though how things are is damaging, but it's comfortable because you are there, like
Well, they call it
um
herd mentality, right? So they call it like, just because everyone is going that way, that's why you go that way, and you're kind of like conditioned not to ask questions. Why? Because this is our culture. Like this is the way that we make decisions and how we act on those things. And so it's really a well-designed strategy for mass control or mass hypnosis, I guess, because this is what our cultures are built upon, collectivism.
Yeah, and this is the thing that is most toxic, I think, because it's like you get the thing that is most important for health, that is community and being immersed in relationships, and that gets weaponized into isolating you or creating this immune system. So indeed, it is really hard when you are the only one questioning. You care about people and you care about the community, but you can't. It's kind of like watching a drug addict not recognize that they are addicted. And it's kind of like it's only so much that you can do.
Yeah, except the entire city is addicted. And you're like the only one who is like, wait, why are we taking this?
Mm-hmm.
So who's the crazy one here?
Yeah.
I don't know. It made me think also of like the something that I wrote in a previous Medium piece, which was around collective awareness requires collective suffering.
Mm,
So the awareness comes from the experience of suffering. And unless it's experienced collectively, we will not reach a collective awareness of it. And this is, for example, like quite often how we think about climate change in the sustainability space as well. Like you don't see political will until basically you have a majority of the population, especially of the elite population, who is actually suffering from that impact. And by the time that, it reaches that point, chances are it's already too late. And so that's why you have, all these theories of change, etc. And they often say things about like, oh, this 25% threshold or whatever, at which like there'll be a waterfall effect. Never saw that happening. Sorry. Maybe not in global south context because we have collectivist cultures that are based upon what the majority are doing. Maybe you have, like in some kind of like pockets, like some neighborhoods, etc. Okay, if people are collectively deciding something, but then the issue is that you have broken cultures that are based upon these, broken ways of sense making. So self-gaslighting within the community, etc. That's what needs to be overcome. So theories of change don't work in the global south, especially not the ones that are imported from the West, because it's a different culture. It's a different attitude towards change. And so like when we're
mm,
talking about this collective awareness, I think this is like an extremely difficult thing because of the self-gaslighting mechanism. Ultimately, I just come back to the fact that it's unsalvageable. We are going to have to get to that point, like, with a lot of addicts as well. You are going to
mhm,
have to get to the point where the things that you hold dear are being threatened because of this. And that is the moment that you're going to actually dump in the kitchen sink just to try to make things right again. And by that point, it's already too late. But that is what is going to happen. And at that point,
mhm.
it's still worthwhile, right? To support your friend through that getting well from that addiction because it's not, even though you might have seen it like for 20 years, but that's the reason you're their friend, right? You've stuck around that
Mhm.
long and they finally got there. So, of course, are you going to abandon at that moment? Of course not. You're going to see this thing through and they might die from it. They might die recovering from addiction. But this is something that you have to commit to. No matter how, what wrong path you think they're going down for 20 years. Like at some point, there's going to be this awakening, there's going to be this awareness. And when that awareness comes, like you need to be there for them. This is how I view like this collective awareness aspect in the global south. It's not about trying to convince people about it. It's not about campaigning for it or doing advocacy, but it's about waiting essentially patiently for the realization and then being there to support when they're ready.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that this metaphor of the addiction and the recovery process is so illuminating, at least for me, in terms of what to expect and how difficult that trajectory towards healing is, and the sacrifices required to get to that state of real health, and how difficult it is to get out of that addiction and the comfort zone, even though that is causing a lot of harm for the person and for the people around that person.
And
So
especially when
yeah,
all the systems that you are surrounded by are incentivizing that addiction.
exactly.